Good evening, everyone, and Assalamu alaikum. I'm very pleased to open today's session of Forging Our Future. Through Forging Our Future, we aim to bridge Bangladesh with the rest of the world of public policy. It is our hope that by doing so, we will create a platform that facilitates an exchange of knowledge between Bangladesh and the world, among youth, experts, and policymakers. It is one of the many initiatives we have been diligently working towards in Youth Policy Forum, or YPF as we know it. Over the past 4 years, YPF has worked tirelessly towards integrating youth into the policy process in Bangladesh. We have done this through sustained policy research, dialogue, and advocacy. This has yielded countless projects, ranging from governance apprenticeships, where we pair young people with members of parliament and other political leaders, to policy courses, where we have Oxford and Harvard educated Bangladeshis teaching public policy to young people free of cost. This year, one of our most significant projects is Q, the Coalition for Upgrading Bangladesh Economy. It is our belief that Bangladesh must work towards its own economic upgrading, adding value to its economic processes and diversifying the economy. And we aim to achieve this by building a cross-sectoral coalition of stakeholders, all working together for a Bangladesh better served. Thus, today's session is an important one. We are going to discuss the role of institutions and innovations in economic upgrading. Bangladesh has a long way to go in its journey of economic upgrading, and it is important to learn from the successes of other countries, particularly in understanding what facilitated value addition in those economies, such that we can integrate it into our own context. To this end, I am pleased to hand over this very important and interesting conversation to Dr. Pauline Boerma-Collier. Dr. Boerma-Collier is one of our honorable advisors, as well as an international development veteran and academic. She has helped lead this series from its start and will be moderating today's session. To you, Pauline, ma'am.
Okay, thank you, Zahir, and welcome to everyone. I am really honored to be moderating the second in our series of panel discussions on Forging Our Future on behalf of the Bangladeshi Youth Policy Forum. In this episode of the series, we plan to explore the role that investment and innovation can play in moving countries forward in their efforts to attain greater economic prosperity. We will be placing a particular focus on Korea, which has been especially successful in achieving this. However, we also hope to obtain an understanding of lessons learned from other countries more generally, so as to get a clearer picture of some of the important prerequisites and policy initiatives necessary for moving forward economically. So to this end, it is my real pleasure to welcome today our very distinguished panel. These are Professor Chaiwan Bak, Chairman of the Board of Samsung Electronics. Professor Bak is a former Minister of Strategy and Finance in the Korean government and is also currently Dean of the Graduate School of Governance and President of the Social Sciences Research Institute of Sungkyunkwan University. And our second panelist is Professor Hans-Peter Lankes, who until the end of 2020 was Vice President for Economics and Private Sector Development at the International Finance Corporation of the World Bank Group. And since February 2021, he has been a visiting professor at the London School of Economics. Unfortunately, our third panelist, who was to have been the Honourable Dr. Shamsul Alam, the State Minister of Planning for the government of Bangladesh, has been called away at the last moment to a meeting with the Prime Minister and will therefore not be able to attend. This is very disappointing, as Mr. Alam is the key person in the government who's currently thinking through the transformation that Bangladesh will need to go through to achieve its economic goals. But on the other hand, this does mean that we will have more time for questions and discussion with the two panel members. So the session today is going to proceed as follows. Each of our panelists will speak for between 15 to 20 minutes each. We will start with Professor Bak, followed by Professor Lankes. Then we will open up the discussion to questions from the audience, which the panelists will be invited to respond to. So now it is my very great pleasure to invite Professor Bak to make his presentation, which is entitled Human Resources Development and Governments for economic upgrading, lessons from Korea. Professor Bak, please. Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Do you hear me well?
Yes,
it's
you're
my
audible.
great pleasure and honor to have this precious opportunity. I thank Dr. Pauline Borma Collier and Mr. Jahir Abbas for inviting me to this challenging dialogue. And I'm also glad to see again Professor Hans-Peter Lankes after longer than 3 decades. Before I start, I ask your understanding of my poor English, as I have not frequently used it for a long time. I appreciate Dr. Yang No Yoon, who is willing to help me communicate with you in case of necessity. I'm going to talk about how Korea achieved economic upgrading, focusing on human resource development and national governance, and hopefully derive some lessons to Bangladesh. Next slide, please. First, I will summarize Korea's economic achievement and analyze key driving forces. Next, I will present obstacles to further upgrading. Then I will derive some lessons and suggest tasks for Bangladesh to undertake. Next slide, please. Korea has achieved a surprisingly compressed growth, dubbed by some as the miracle on the Han River. The average annual real growth amounted to 7.0% during the last 7 decades, leading Korea from one of the poorest economies to an advanced one. Next. This image contrasts the 2 Koreas at night. South Korea is 58 times bigger in terms of GDP and about 13 years longer in terms of life expectancy than North Korea. Next, please. Korea maintains decent economic equality and high social mobility as well. The equality index of market income is at the top in the world. In terms of the equality of opportunity and social mobility, Korea belongs to the second best group next to Nordic countries. Next, please. This figure illustrates Korea's low regional income inequalities. Next, please. Then, what are the driving forces for such a remarkable achievement? First, the success is attributed mainly to human resources suitable for the earlier industrialization phase. In terms of quantity, the workforce has exploded thanks to the return of Korean diaspora after liberation from Japan, the influx of North Korean refugees during the Korean War, and the baby boom after the war. More importantly, the public-private partnership in education and the enthusiasm for school, particularly since the 1949 farmland reform, have contributed to supplying middle-skilled workers. The adult illiteracy rate dramatically dropped down in 2 decades. The effect of farmland reform on the human resource development may be elaborated on later. The college entrance rate is in highest class in the world. Besides, Korea has fostered substantial manpower in STEM, that is to say, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. In particular, engineering graduates outnumbers those from Germany, the UK, and Sweden in total, and Korea has long been dominant in the international vocational training competition. Such a focus on STEM has been the backbone of Korea's competitive manufacturing. Next slide, please. The left graph shows that Korea's shares of graduates in public institutions are much lower than the OECD averages due to active public-private partnership in education. The right graph illustrates that Korea's share of tertiary graduates in STEM is the second highest. Next slide, please. The other driving force was a relatively sound national governance. Above all, technocrats dominated over politicians during the year of fast growth. Economic policies were based on far-sighted visions with minimal distortions from politics. As a result, Korea boasts of transparent, universal, and effective public services, including healthcare, e-government, and public utility and transportation. Also, concentration and clustering for the hub and spoke strategy worked quite well. Limited resources were selectively allocated based on the linkage between planning and budget. Outward-looking and export-driven policies were effectively carried out. A high priority was given to R&D in particular. Next slide, please. These tables exhibit Korea's intensive science and technology clusters. Next slide, please. Korea's R&D manpower proportion to population and its ratio of R&D expenditure to GDP are the highest in the world. Next slide, please. Other success factors are listed in the slide. Among them, I would like to underline self-supporting work ethics influenced by the government-led new community movement during the 1970s through 1990s. The government implemented a series of enlightenment classes aiming to enhance the spirit of diligence and self-support. Best practices, including self-made persons, were introduced and spread all over the country. And you cannot leave out relentless challenges and innovations of passionate pioneering entrepreneurs like Lee Gun-hee of Samsung, Jung Ju-young of Hyundai, or Park Tae-jun of POSCO, whom I may have a chance to expand on later during the discussion. Next slide, please. By virtue of the factors mentioned so far, Korea now ranks high in innovation. Next slide. So much compliment for Korea's achievement, but Korea has enough on its plate to struggle with several obstacles to further upgrading. Next, please. Ironically, the key driving forces have been now converted into bottlenecks. Above all, human competence is lagging behind in light of the rapidly advancing fourth industrial revolution. First, Koreans' learning is on the surface, not deep. This worked well when Korea was developing with a standardized massive production at an earlier industrialization phase. However, the current educational system does not encourage creative thinking. Consequently, Koreans are very good at doing what the manual describes or what superiors order them to do. but they have not been accustomed to dealing with something new beyond memorization or middle-skilled competence. Second, Korean entities are rigidly hierarchical with strict seniority rules. Koreans thus tend to wait for superiors' opinions. The organization is not open to take new ideas, and the incentive structure discourages risk-taking. Third, insufficient lifelong learning due partially to long work hours and commute time aggravates the situation. Fourth, there exists a chronic oversupply of graduates in HEAL, that is to say, humanities and social sciences vis-a-vis STEM. Next, please. In terms of learning hours and the frequency of learning at work, Korean workers rank at the bottom among OECD peers. Next, please. The other obstacles are outdated rules and practices. Being distinctive from global standards, they discourage entrepreneurship and innovation. Coupled with the tendency of reluctance to share and collaborate, they cause the tardy evolution of the innovation ecosystem. Service industries are underproductive because of obsolete licensing and tight regulations. For instance, ride-sharing and telemedicine services are not fully allowed due to resistance from existing industries. In addition, discriminatory regulations or sports by mostly business sides promote the so-called Peter Pan syndrome and hence weaken a growth ladder. Owing to rigid labor regulations, self-governing labor management relations are yet to be settled. Labor market rules and practices like procrastine bad disregard often ruthlessly individual differences or special circumstances. Next, please. Korea depends excessively on fossil fuels. Its carbon pricing and carbon productivity are so low that the burden of living up to the Paris Agreement would be heavy. Next, please. What are the lessons for Bangladesh? Next, please. There are some similarities between Bangladesh and Korea. A high population density may work to your advantage for digitalization, as evidenced in Korea. In addition, you may convert poor natural resources to a blessing in disguise, as Korea has developed cutting-edge technology for nuclear power generation. Fast growth following structural improvements is the other common feature of the two countries. Next, please. The left graph shows a solidly growing real GDP of Bangladesh, while the right one demonstrates the importance of structural improvements. Next, please. Bangladesh has several strengths and a huge potential, including the common use of English and abundant young and qualified workforce. At the same time, it suffers from a few difficulties: low social mobility, early marriage practice, and rigid bureaucracy seem to be among them. Next, please. This slide describes the lowest social mobility and the highest early marriage rate of Bangladesh among Asian countries. Next, please. Considering Bangladesh's circumstances and Korea's experiences, I would suggest the following three. First, learning research and development, focusing on STEM is at top of the list. After all, a key element of any successful economy is the quality of its workforce. R&D includes skill building, online lifelong learning, attracting extraordinary overseas talents, and the clustering of STEM institutions and companies. Second, some structural impediments appear to be in urgent need of reform. Among them are energy subsidy and carbon tax, low skill levels of female workers, as well as outdated culture and practices. Next, please. The left graph shows Bangladesh's low labor productivity, while the right one depicts Bangladesh's subnormal foreign direct investment. Next, please. Finally, we cannot forget about business-friendly sentiment and policies. For example, establishing the rule of law along with the digital government, market-friendly regulations fitting with global standards, a troubleshooting system like a business ombudsman against bureaucratic inertia, inspiring entrepreneurship and encouraging challenge spirit are essential. Next, please. Well, as I do not know much about Bangladesh, my presentation may contain a bias or serious errors. Nonetheless, I hope it has provided you with an opportunity to look into what Korea has done right or wrong, and thus to ponder on them. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Professor Bach. This has been a very clear and absolutely fascinating presentation. Thank you again. Yeah. So now I would like to invite Professor Lankes to make his presentation. The title is Relaunching Development Sustainably, a Big Push for Investment and Technology-Led Growth. Professor Lankes.
Thank you very much, Pauline. And it's a real pleasure being with you all, and in fact, with the future of Bangladesh, with the participants at this meeting. And it's a pleasure seeing you, Minister Jaewon Bach. We share an alma mater, and I have to say your presentation was just fascinating. It's very interesting, as if we had coordinated before. You focus on the human element in development, and do so in a very impressive way, the way that Korea has developed. I will focus a bit more on the physical element, and I will look at what we can say about development in general going forward for countries including Bangladesh. In fact, Bangladesh is one of the great hopes out there for development. It's a country that faces many challenges. You have mentioned some, Minister. There are many others. Nature is a challenge in Bangladesh. But it is a country that has done many things right and that has made very impressive progress. I was going to quote a World Bank report from just a month ago about Bangladesh, but it's perhaps a little bit too time consuming, but it is glowing in its assessment of Bangladesh's ability to generate growth and to progress on the Human Development Index. So you're asking me to comment on what can be learned from the world, but in fact, the world must learn from Bangladesh. I will set out the broad challenges facing developing countries and that we need an investment and technology-led growth strategy to set them and the world on a long-term sustainable trajectory. And that will include the complementary work that needs to take place on human capital and on institutions and on a variety of other fronts. I will be drawing on work done over the past year by colleagues and myself at the LSE, mostly with Lord Stern, at the Brookings Institution with Amar Bhattacharya and Homi Kharas, and at Oxford Blavatnik School with Paul Collier, who you are familiar with. So there's little time and much to say, so I cannot always provide much empirical background. I will be provocative, and as you will see, you will have to believe me. Let me see how I can manage with the screen sharing. Here we go. I hope that everybody can see the presentation on the screen now. Development in general is what I would call at a crossroads. There's an adverse environment globally. First, we have underlying long-run challenges that we're all familiar with. There has been a slowdown in global growth that goes back decades now. There's been a slowdown in investment. There's been a slowdown in productivity. And that is true in many developing countries, not all, and it is true in the advanced economies. There is job creation, but often jobs are of relatively low quality or informal. There is technology transfer, but often technology creates islands. You have countries that have both world-beating technologies and firms, and very low quality and low productivity ones, and those coexist. You have a growth in inequality in many countries, not all. We've seen Korea. Korea is exceptional in preventing inequality from growing. But you compare that with countries ranging from the United States and the UK to China to many, many others, there's been a tremendous growth in inequality, which makes you wonder whether that is sustainable over the longer term. You have pressures on social cohesion from the demographic transition, from aging, and from the lack of a new social contract for how to deal with age and with youth, in fact. And you have the growing threats from climate change, from environmental degradation, biodiversity loss. Bangladesh has lots to say about that, and is actually one of the countries that has been out there showing the world how to deal with adaptation needs. With that, these longer-term threats are compounded by shorter-term headwinds from the high debt that has built up, from the divergent recoveries from the pandemic. There were very large differences in policy support, in access to vaccines, which show in the way that countries have been recovering. We have China sort of stuttering. China has been a motor of global growth, but now has slowed down for a variety of reasons. And we have, of course, the energy and food shocks and the global rise in inflation and interest rates, which have been turbocharged, as I would call it, by the fallout from the Ukraine war. All of these are major headwinds that the global economy and developing countries have to deal with now. That includes Bangladesh, which has done so well in many other ways. This just to give you a brief sense of the slowdown in global growth. Sorry, I'm not not great at drawing with my mouse, but you see IMF data going back to 1980. Actually, we would see this even more strongly if we went back to 1960 or even 1950. The blue line, the lower line, with the green straight line there, that is advanced economies as identified by the IMF. There has been really a secular decline in their growth rates, driven by a secular decline in productivity. And the other line, the red line, the one that's up there, those are emerging markets and developing economies. They saw a significant increase in growth from the 1980s to the 2000s, then a strong boost in the early 2000s. And since then, there has been a decline in their growth rates generally, in part driven by what we're seeing happening in China. Now, how do we go forward? We have to find ways of building a robust, a sustainable recovery and growth. And as I would argue, this has to be centered on investment in all forms of capital, including human capital, on technology and on the energy transition. there is a bit of a sense sometimes that development and climate goals might be in opposition. That is just incorrect. You cannot turn, and we should not turn this into a trade-off. We need growth, but growth can be sustainable and consistent with a longer-term climate sustainable future. For growth, we need investment and we need technological change. And today, investment is too low and technology is too slow. The focus in this decade must be on accelerating both. A strategy for investment and growth would have three objectives. One is to restore investment to pre-pandemic levels from which it has plummeted, and then increase investment by a further 2 to 4% of GDP. I will give some numbers on that. Secondly, to ensure that the new wave of technology and innovation that we've seen over the past 2-3 decades building up is also built into the future capital stock. And third, to align financing sources, that is both domestic and international, with that investment push. Of course, there is much more that needs to happen. And we've heard Professor Bach telling us about one very important part of this, which is the human capital dimension. There's also the need for debt restructuring. There is a need for good policies that are consistent with bringing investment and talent. There is a need for strong institutions, a modernized social contract, a benign geopolitical and security environment, and other things. But I will focus on this core of investment and technology. What about this big push on investment? If you look at it in the past 3, 4, 5 decades, as you can see here on this chart, fixed capital formation as a share of GDP has been declining fairly significantly in the high income countries. You can see on the left, that's the black meandering line, was in the early 70s on the order of 25, 26% of GDP. But now we're looking at around 21% of GDP. That is a long-term decline. In emerging markets and middle-income countries, there has been a significant increase. That is the gray line that you see on top in the investment ratio to GDP. But if you take China out of that equation, it is much less impressive. That is the red line. And the red line, one thing it shows you is that going up and down and being somewhat volatile over the decades, the investment to GDP ratio has been declining since about 2008 by 2 to 3 percentage points of GDP. In addition, during the pandemic, we have seen a very significant sharp decline in investment ratios. The red bars represent the emerging markets and developing economies, and you see there was a decline by 15% in 2020. Much of that has not been recouped yet. Investment priorities, and as I mentioned, it is important to get back to pre-pandemic levels and then grow from there at least some 2 to 3% of GDP to make up for the loss that we've seen over the past decade or two in developing countries. And that investment will have to focus on a variety of areas. One very important area is human capital, and we've heard about that. A second is sustainable infrastructure, and that the challenge there is to manage the key transitions that we are going to have for energy and cities and other systems. The third area is agriculture, food, and land use, and the fourth that Bangladesh is very familiar with is adaptation and resilience. These categories, they overlap and they're complementary. They all have to do with investing into our future. We have done a fairly detailed assessment of the investment needs together with Brookings Institution. We have presented that to the finance ministers, the Global Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Change. We are presenting it as we speak in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt at the COP. those are investment targets. If you just want to focus on the left and the middle pie here, the gross spending on investment on sustainable infrastructure, that is the orange piece of the pie, represented in developing countries, excluding China, about 3.5% of GDP just before the pandemic. This was $730 billion. In our analysis, this has to grow by 2025 to some 4.7% of GDP. We have to add more than 1 percentage points worth of GDP to a level of over $1 trillion in sustainable infrastructure. Of course, GDP is growing. If you are making the proportions there, they don't seem to fit. That is because GDP itself is growing, and then they have to keep growing until the end of the decade to by another percentage points of GDP. Here is where we see the 2 percentage points of GDP in investment, in this case, sustainable infrastructure, that we have to make possible between now and the end of this decade. These numbers seem large. We can come back to this if there are questions. These numbers seem large, but I will come back to why they are feasible. The second key ingredient, as discussed, is technology, and technology is a key enabler. But the history of technology is actually quite interesting. It tends to take a long time for technology, for important new technologies, the so-called general purpose technologies, to find their way into every corner of an economy and to truly drive productivity. You see this chart on the right, that comes from a book, it goes back some time, but it shows the time it took for electrification, which arrived, this is the dotted line, which arrived in the United States, in this case, in 1894. The time it took to really cover a large share of households. Only by 1939, it had reached about 80% of households. That's 50 years later. In the IT revolution, which arrived, so to speak, in the early 1970s, by 2003, it had only reached about 60% of households. This is just one indicator. There are many others. It's sort of called the Solow paradox. Bob Solow is a Nobel Prize winning economist who in 1987 said, you can see the computer age everywhere except in the productivity statistics. It takes time for technologies to diffuse throughout the economy. But many of the technologies, many of the groundbreaking technologies that have been developed are actually now reaching a stage of maturity where we can expect to see them diffuse more rapidly across economies. And I will give 3 examples. One here is climate technologies. If you look at the lower left chart, it may be too small for you, but what it says is that the International Energy Agency has been making projections every year for what the investment in the annual investment in solar plants was going to be going forward. And you see these dark lines, those are the levels at which the IEA projected investments going forward. These are gigawatt per year. The reality is the dotted line. So the IEA has been missing the mark by a very large margin. The actual development has been much faster. And one explanation you see in the second chart, the one in the middle, which shows the cost decreases since 2010 for different renewable energy technologies. Solar PV, yellow, has seen an 82% cost decrease. And the others are other technologies, each of which has seen a very significant decrease. So they have become commercial. If you now look at the chart on the right, which I'm sure you cannot read because it is too small, the impression it should give you, these are all different technologies in areas ranging from power to transport to heating, trucking, agriculture, land use to fugitive oil and gas, steel, cement, chemicals. The darker red the more incipient, the earlier this technology. They still sit in the lab. They are not commercially viable. As you move to green, they become commercially viable. They become mass market technologies. And when it becomes dark green, they are so-called late market technologies. On the left, we have 2015. That's not long ago. There was none of the key low carbon technologies was fully commercially viable at that time. You move into the middle, that's 2020, so just a couple of years ago. Power had fully moved into the mass market stage because of the phenomenon you see on the left charts, and many other technologies had moved forward, where in certain markets they were already competitive. If you look forward to 2030, that is a prediction made by Systemic, which is a fairly credible outfit, and it's consistent with what the IEA, the International Energy Agency, is projecting. You would see that a large number, and this represents the size of these industries in the total, a large number of technologies, about 70% of the total emissions, it would have commercially viable low carbon technologies. That's happening, and those technologies are going to be built in and must be built in to the new capital stock. Second example is digital technologies. This is from my time at IFC. We had set ourselves targets. You see 5 companies on the right, different development needs, and how digital technologies based on mobile connectivity can meet development needs, can provide development solutions on a very large scale. At the top, you had Mobisol, which is a distributed renewables outfit based on mobile phone payment systems. That is, our target was to reach 250 million people, and that's just IFC supporting these companies. You go through different areas: access to credit, healthcare, learning, and then bank accounts. At the bottom, you see Bcash, which is the Bangladeshi firm, which of course all of you know, which has been just tremendously successful at reaching people with digital payment services. These technologies are capable of a mass reach that we couldn't dream of just a few decades ago. So digital technologies are going to be a big part of our investment and technology push going forward. The third area is agribusiness technologies. Let me not get into this. It's much more complicated. These are different, many different areas, in each of which there has been significant work in the past few decades. There are precedents set, and we can replicate, we can start to grow them, from genetics and genomics to robotics to farming systems, innovative food, renewable energy, of course, supply chain technologies. In all of these areas, there has been technological progress which can be diffused into the market on a broad scale, and that will happen over the next decade or so. All right, these were 3 examples of technology. Let me just close by looking at financing. These were very large investment numbers that I've mentioned earlier. 2, 3, 4 percentage points of GDP that need to be added in order to enable what we've been looking at. How is this going to be financed? And we did a study which was presented last week in Sharm el-Sheikh to ministers. It got a lot of headlines in the press. It was commissioned by Egypt and the UK for the COP27. We are identifying various sources of finance that we feel are realistic sources of finance and on which we need to push forward. On the left, this is domestic resource mobilization, combination of taxes and local capital markets. What you're looking at is the incremental finance needed over the next couple of years up to 2025 to finance that trillion in additional investments. I want to point to, so there are different sources, as you can see, and we will need a broad-based financing strategy. Let me focus on one, which is the one we have the most control over and that we need to push. here's the same numbers. The one I want to focus on is here in the middle, the non-concessional MDB finance, which in our view can triple and must triple by 2025. Those are multilateral development banks. They have far more potential to grow and help meet financing gaps. Currently, multilateral development banks have a capital base of around $700 billion. They're lending about 70 billion. I'm looking only at the classic 5 multilateral development banks. There are, of course, others as well. This, for instance, does not include the EIB. They have, with 38 billion in additional paid-in capital one time, they would double their capital base. There's this thing called callable capital, which is 20 times more than the paid-in capital, and most countries can provide without a budgetary cost. In our view, more than half of that could and should come from emerging markets in order to also grow their share in the governance of these institutions. There's then scope for adjusting the gearing ratio through the better utilization of capital. I'm a member of a G20 panel on capital adequacy of the multilateral development banks. We delivered our report in July. It is now in the process of being implemented. We believe that there can be an increase in the gearing ratio in the lending of these institutions, even if they do not receive additional capital. That would allow a trebling of MDB lending. That in turn can be used and must be used much more than in the past. We're living in a new world in which private markets are very significant. That was not the case a few decades ago in development. Today they are. MDBs have to mobilize these private markets, and that is where very significant sums can be brought in. Our estimate is 400 to 800 billion in private financing. This is where we get our trillion. So this chart, and this is what I'm going to close with, displays this a little bit. How can we leverage up the capital and the capacity of the multilateral development banks in order to make a much bigger contribution to the investment needs that we have going forward. Pauline, with this, I will leave it, and we can, of course, come back during our discussion.
Oh, thank you very much, really, for that excellent overview. We would, I think, like to have now, I think we should go ahead to the questions, because we have many people who are wanting to pose questions to both the panelists. I think we have really an exceptionally large audience, and our Youth Policy Forum team has been selecting questions that have been coming in from our online audience. So obviously we can't cover all the questions that are coming in, but we will try and select questions that are largely representative of the areas of interest being expressed by the audience. We have some people who are actually going to present in person, and other questions that will come in online that I will then convey to the panelists. But I thought we'd kick off with Shafqat Shafiq, who is the YPF Fellow for Big Data and Poverty. He has a couple of questions that he would like to ask the two panelists. So perhaps we can give the floor to Shafqat briefly, and please keep your questions very brief to allow as many people as possible to ask questions.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Am I audible? I believe yes. I am.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much for the presentation. To be honest with you, it was an exceptional opportunity for me to learn. I'm a data scientist. I'm based out of Sydney. I work primarily in the private sector, but I crunch numbers for a living. I had two questions, and I'm going to keep them very brief. The first question that I had was with regards to South Korea's smooth transition from being a manufacturing economy to being a service-oriented economy by resisting global economic shocks, because we understand that as a manufacturing economy, you're more susceptible towards global economic shocks because manufacturing is one of the more volatile industries. This is of primary concern to Bangladesh because we are developing ourselves as an exporting economy at the moment. So I think this question is primarily directed to Dr. Bach. If you could shed some light as to how South Korea did that. My second question, and this is to both the panelists, is the importance of using economic data to monitor business cycles. I'm based out of Australia, and we have a very healthy data culture over here. We have very strong collaborations between the private and the public sector with regards to sharing data. And I think that, I mean, as a data guy, I believe that data is the new oil. So how did South Korea integrate economic data into its mainstream economic policy formulation? Yeah, these are my two questions. It'd be great to have your thoughts on this. Thank you.
Perhaps I could pass this on to Professor Bach initially, and maybe Dr. Yoon may be on standby to help out.
Thank you for your quite demanding questions. You know, Korea is very, Korean manufacturing industry is very competitive because the industry has been exposed to keen international competition for so long. But Korea's service industry has been tightly regulated domestically, and it has not been exposed to global competition. So the service industry, as I presented before, is underproductive. But the government is trying to, open the service market so that the service industry has, has strengthened strong competitiveness. For example, the Korean movie industry fiercely opposed to repealing the quota for domestic films and opening the market in the early 2000s. To our surprise, however, Korean movies have made great strides since the opening of the market to imported films. I think that was a good example implying on keen competition leads to the enhanced competitiveness. In service industries, Korea has a long way to go, but we need to open the market and strengthen the competition. That's the right way for Korea to go, I guess. That's my answer to your first question. And to your second question, in the past, the statistics announced by the Korean government was not reliable, I guess. By in the past, I mean in the 1960s through 1970s, the statistics sometimes had been maneuvered or massaged, I say, by the government for political purposes, but since early 1980s, the problem has been, minimized. I should say the problem disappeared. Thanks to the efforts of the technocrats who devoted to straighten the statistics, and he honestly, revealed some secrets and dark sides of the Korean statistics, and since then, the Korean statistics announced by the government is, I guess, clean and reliable, so that the government and academia could use the statistics without any question or doubts. I don't know, this may satisfies your questions or doubts. Will that be okay, or any other doubts?
I wonder if I could pass this on briefly to Professor Lankes for any general observations he might have, although it's not specifically to Korea, but you may have some additional comments to make on the content of that question.
Yeah, just very briefly, because I felt what Professor Bach said was already quite broad. The economic data, absolutely. If we talk at the macro level, it's astonishing to what extent we still do not have very basic data, like what is being invested, how much is being invested, what is being financed, what is actually private finance. It's very surprising we don't have. What is countries' debt? This is one of the big struggles that we're seeing, because some debt is very non-transparent. There is a need for data for all the good reasons that you mentioned, in order to be able to target investment and financial support for it. At the micro level, data is absolutely, it's the gold, it's the future. All the digital development solutions that we were talking about, that I was mentioning, they're all data driven. How do you get financial access, which is a big issue in many countries still? Well, it's data-driven digital financial services. If you look at Ant Financial in China, this has been sort of a tremendous case of reaching people. Has reached people through data, because they don't need collateral for lending. They use information on people's behaviors instead of collateral. And the same has been true in many sort of other financial services, including insurance, health insurance in Africa. If you take this example, how health insurance is now spreading, it's based on data, because health insurance is often targeted at women. Women don't have collateral. How do you work your way through financial services in this new world? It's data. So I fully agree with you. Very important. And in fact, if we had more ways of, so it's one of the big constraints on data is, of course, data privacy and the way data is handled. The whole architecture around data is an important basis on which to build this future.
Thank you very much. I'd like to go on to the next question, which is from Fatima from the Youth Policy Forum. So if you could let Fatima in, please, Zahir, for her to ask. Fatima Tuz Johura, please, go ahead.
Thank you, Pauline. Thank you so much, Professor Bach and Professor Lankas. Wonderful presentations, very insightful. So I have two questions. First one is about industrial policies. So far we have seen that in the Asian tiger economies, mostly governments have picked the winners and then supported them for better economic progress. So in a country like Bangladesh, should our government now handpick winners and then support them through industrial policies, or should it be more collaborative through dialogues? And because there is a risk of that if we focus too much on the winners, then there are other industries which are not being able to flourish as much. So that's the first question. And the next one is about, as we are talking about technology transfers and, like innovation, so eventually there will be more automation through this fourth industrial revolution. So, and there is a lot of discussion around would automation take over employment for a country like Bangladesh, where we have like we're a very populous country. So this is a big concern for us. So how the government or we should balance this two. And I have realized that I forgot to introduce myself. I am working with YPF, with the CUBE team, and I'm also working with Oxfam, Great Britain. Thank you so much.
Pauline ma'am, I just wanted to add one line with this question. So, in the industrial policy discourse seems to have shifted from picking winners to letting losers go. So I wanted to ask also Peter, Dr. Lankas and Dr. Bach, is picking winners easier and letting losers go difficult? How do you manage the political economy of
that? Professor Bach, maybe you could go first.
Thank you for your rather challenging questions. I guess the Bangladesh has limited resources except the human capital and perhaps natural gas. So like Korea, I would like to suggest you concentration, selective concentration, meaning not just picking winners, but selecting strategically promising fields or industries. By doing that, you could gain efficiency, and you may go you may go a long way. And I think there could be, in general, two strategies for competitiveness. One seeks low cost based on abundant resources, whereas the other pursues high quality and brand power. In the initial stage, in the beginning, it may be inevitable to rely on low-cost strategy, but ultimately you have to pick, you have to resort to high-quality strategy. So I would say picking not individual, company or specific, area, but selective, strategic, planning of competitive or promising field may be better. The second question there is, a dispute between automation and growth without employment. But, about 300 years of history since the first industrial revolution proves that the technological progress could go with employment and leisure. Of course, the automation or the applying the AI may result in the reduction of employment in that specific field, but it would enhance productivity and the positive impact will spread over the wide economy. So in the other field, the employment may increase. What I'm trying to say is automation or robotization or introduction of artificial intelligence may not necessarily reduce employment. We are faced with keen global competition. If you are objecting to the automation for fear of reduced employment, then I guess you will be lagging behind the other countries in the respect of productivity. So I guess the right way may be inducing automation and facilitating robotization and increasing the productivity and income and leisure together. That's the general way of, I guess, progress. Thank you.
Pauline, do you want me to just add a few words to this?
Please, yes. Sorry. Yes, go ahead. Yeah.
I think, this was very much the point I wanted to make, but a couple of additional observations. One is your really interesting question, better pick winners or let losers go. I'm very much on the side of letting losers go. You can look at this in the aggregate. Many countries have a very wide distribution of the productivity or efficiency of firms. And there are firms, I mentioned this before in my presentation, that are world-beating, and there are firms that are very, very far behind and of very low productivity coexisting in the same countries. That curve, and what I would call the tail of inefficient firms, that tail has grown over the past 2 decades in many countries, in part because money has become cheap. We had a lot of global liquidity, and global liquidity has allowed less productive firms to survive. But what happens then is this absorbs resources. The continued existence of a growing group of not very productive firms absorbs resources from the rest of the economy, brings down productivity growth, and productivity is what drives incomes. I was also mentioning the quality of labor. We have a problem of low quality labor. That low quality labor reflects low productivity labor, generally speaking. So we have to allow technical progress to go forward, because that is what is going to drive income growth and more generally the quality of development. We want that. But at the same time, we need to allow sectors in which, as Professor Bach said, productivity is reducing the workforce, we need to allow people to move into other sectors that are growing. So countries and policies have to enable mobility. And that's a big deal. The enabling mobility involves learning, training, retraining. It also involves letting growth industries grow. And that is not a given because you have lots of constraints in many countries around different industries. So let losers go, but you have to combine that with a policy that proactively helps to shift people into the better productivity. China is a great example of how this can be done right over many decades, where you have had a shift of 400+ million people from low productivity agriculture into gradually higher productivity in manufacturing. If you look at the textile sector in Bangladesh, of course, Bangladesh is the world's second largest exporter of textiles at this point. It's a big sector, 4.5 million people working in it. Technological progress is going to affect the textile sector in a big way. And we will see, as we've seen with China, as we've seen with the United States, North Carolina, even Massachusetts, just 100 years ago, we will see other countries beginning to take market share from Bangladesh at the low end. But at the same time, Bangladesh has a lot of scope to scale, to improve the quality of its textile sector. And a lot is happening. You have some great firms in there. And the sector as a whole, the projection, and I'm looking at one here by McKinsey, is that currently we have about $2.5 trillion worth of demand for the textile sector, that this is going to grow by 2030. It will be doubling to over 4 trillion by 2030. So there will be higher productivity through innovation in some sectors, but at the same time, there will be an increase in demand. So what we see is a shift, not a decline necessarily in the aggregate, certainly not a decline in the labor force.
I wonder, sorry, please.
Could I elaborate on my answer further? I mean, to your first question, the Korea's experience has it that, I projected the lowest regional inequality among the OECD countries. And the Korea concentrated investment in certain area. But after that, the hub and spokes strategy worked quite well, and the positive effect, has kind of externalities over the other regions. So in 1960s and in 1970s, the eastern part of Korean Peninsula was a lot richer than the western part, and the metropolitan Seoul area was a lot richer than the other regions. But nowadays, it's almost the same. So what I'm trying to say is picking the winner could, result in ultimately the reduction in economic inequality. And the second point is about 40 years of statistics of Korea shows that the productivity goes in hand with employment. So when productivity is high, then employment increases. which means that the automation or robotization may increase employment. That's my, point. Thank you.
I just wanted to briefly perhaps move away from the economic aspects to a question that's come in from our online audience, which asks, this is from Talibur Rahman, and he asks how to bring together stakeholders, especially youth, to leverage/strengthen soft power for economic development. So this is more a question of how you get the young people on board. I mean, if you had examples in Korea, did the youth play a part at all in this process of development, or was it not relevant for what happened? But obviously, this is an issue that is very close to people's hearts, especially the ones who are watching this program.
Well, during the fast growth era, the male Koreans have to serve military services for about 3 years. In other words, most Korean male youngsters has an experience of serving the military. During the military camp, they learn the so-called can-do spirit. You can do whatever your boss order. That kind of can-do spirit helped, I guess, the Korean economic growth in a sense. And at that time, most workers, were kind of, the fighting, against the enemy. Koreans at that time worked about 1,000 hours yearly, more than Germans. They work very hard and diligently, and they had teamwork at work site. As I said, Korean economy's competitiveness comes from mass production. The mass production requires co-work and cooperation. That kind of spirit was cultivated while they were in the army. And I don't know, this is not the appropriate answer to such a stupid answer to a wise question, but
I wonder if if I could interject, the soft power of youth in Korea, maybe more recently, the sort of cultural evolution of Korea on the world stage, that is a youth phenomenon also. I think that has hugely enhanced the profile of Korea amongst many people in the world. I mean, would that be something of some soft power, perhaps, of the youth?
Yeah, I was talking about the youngsters in the past, and the question was, directed about the current youngsters, mode or energy. So I have to think about that.
Yes. Okay. Well, maybe another related question that has come in is from Razik Aziz Kabir, who's from the Department of Economics in the University of Dhaka. He said, is there a significant correlation between the economic growth of South Korea and the cultural values that the Koreans have cherished for so long? Do you think that culture plays a part in, or has played a part, a unique part in South Korea's economic growth?
Yeah, I think like most of East Asian countries, in a sense, Confucianism played some role in the economic growth in Korea, and as I said, it strict seniority rule and obedience and diligence and the tendency to save, not to consume much, and something like those kind of culture contributed to the economic growth in a sense. But these days, as I said, the seniority rules and hierarchical structure may affect adversely the economic upgrading. So it has pros and cons. The cultural factors has a pros and cons to economic growth in Korea. Yes.
Okay, thank you. I think maybe we can go back to a more economically oriented question, which is coming from Sirazum Munira Rayan, also from the University of Dhaka. Yes, please, go ahead.
Could I say, with regard to the culture and the can-do spirit, I must introduce Chairman Park Tae-jun of POSCO, which is the fourth largest crude steel producer in the world currently. And this is also related to IBRD too. The anecdote has it that the Chairman Park Tae-jun asked money to construct the steel plant to the IBRD, and the IBRD, rejected his, ask, stating that it is a delusion, like roses, are blooming in a trash can. And so the Chairman Park Tae-jun used the significant portion of repatriation money from Japan for the damages or losses during the Japanese ruling in the first half of the 20th century. And Park Tae-jun successfully completed the fascinating steel company, one of the most competitive steel company in the world. He conjectured that for Korea to achieve second stage of industrial revolution, we absolutely need, crude steel plant. His, challenge was right, and thanks to his dedication, Korea now boasts of competitiveness in making cars and building ships. And, he has left a long list of quotation. For example, resources are limited, but creativity is limitless. Or this plant is being built, for our ancestors' blood. So if we fail, we must dive into the nearby sea. Or, he said, let me see. In any case, the state-run companies, POSCO was at that time state-run companies. As you are well aware, state-run companies have usually agency dilemmas, inefficiency problems. Those were minimized by virtue of Park Tae-jun's outstanding leadership. Korea's steel use per capita is well ahead of any other country now relative to its income. So that's my, introduction of I really think Park Tae-jun's POSCO was the first turning point of Korea's industrialization. Second turning point was Lee Geun-hee of Samsung. Lee Geun-hee changed Korea's industry, its focal point from quantity to quality, from low cost to high quality. That was his contribution, I guess. I may expand on later.
Okay, thank you very much. We are beginning to run out of time, but we've got, we can have one more question, which is the one that I was beginning to ask you, which is about this is coming from Sirazum Munira Rayan from the University of Dhaka. So she has asked, how has South Korea been preparing for the fourth industrial revolution? What were the factors that have been focused on, and what policy measures can ensure Bangladesh's preparedness for the fourth industrial revolution? And I would like to direct this question to both Professor Bach and Professor Lankes, because one, of course, is Korea specific, but it would also be interesting to have Professor Lankes's perspective on countries like Bangladesh trying, to be prepared for the fourth industrial revolution, and what should be done to enable this to happen. Perhaps we can start again with Professor Bach and then go on to Professor Lankes.
Thank you. You know, Korea has a long way to go for the fourth industrial revolution. As I presented, you know, Korea's human resources and human competence is currently like B grade, not C or D grade, but A grade either. So the human competence was good for the earlier industrialization, but way short of the ongoing post-industrialization. So we need to upgrade our education, you know, enhance deep learning, also strengthening the lifelong learning. That's the first, I guess, the task for Korea to attack. And the second one is the update the regulations, rules, and environments. The current politics, hurts and discourages innovation and entrepreneurship. Unlike the politics in the past, so-called populism is the one we have to overcome. So in two respects of key driving forces of the past success have been turned into bottlenecks these days. So we need to upgrade human competence. And secondly, we need to, renew or overcome autocracy and populist stance. That was my answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Lankes, if you could give us a more general picture of what countries need to do in a way to really prepare themselves to participate fully and take advantage of what they call the fourth industrial revolution, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, so clearly a key foundation of the fourth industrial revolution is going to be the digital economy. In countries at all levels of development, we need to prepare the infrastructure for the development of the digital economy. And that is the digital infrastructure itself that would sort of carry the hardware for it. It would be enabling the payment system that the digital economy is going to depend on. It will be about enabling digital entrepreneurship, and that has to do with the myriad ways in which government can enable or restrict entrepreneurship to allow digital entrepreneurs to enter different types of markets. The financial sector that is already happening in Bangladesh. There are other sectors, especially in agriculture, which can be somewhat sensitive and where there is resistance to change. Well, if we want that revolution to go forward, we need to enable change. And that kind of enabling is important. And then the government itself can can shift to e-government platforms. We know that, actually, I'm not so sure where Bangladesh stands on it. We know this from India, of course. The creation of these digital accounts has given a tremendous boost so e-government is giving a tremendous boost to the digital economy. So infrastructure, the transactions and payments accounts, enabling that, the digital entrepreneurship, and the e-government are a couple of practical ways in which all countries will have to be and can push the industrial revolution. And we need the public sector in there, and then we need to allow the private sector to build on that. We need both.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. I think, unfortunately, we are running out of time, and we are going to have to stop here because our time is nearly up. So I would like to extend a sincere thanks to both our panel members for a really very interesting and stimulating discussion, and also to our young audience for their attention and engagement. I'm really sorry that we just don't have enough time for all the questions that have been coming in. But I also, realize that both our panel members are incredibly busy people, and so we are very appreciative of the time you've given to the Youth Policy Forum and to participate in this panel. Anyway, but before we go, I would like to hand over to the Youth Policy Organizing Committee for a final word. Thank you.
Thank you so much, madam. I just want to thank our two panelists. It has been an incredibly insightful and enlightening session for the young people in the audience. I was receiving message that how much they learned and appreciated this. While I say this, I'm also sad that our planning minister could not join today, but we'll make sure that the great lessons and learnings from this session, we take it and then we sort of share it, not only with the planning minister, but also with other ministers and civil servants. And I'm very delighted that many of the civil servants from Ministry of Finance and other ministries were in the audience, both in Zoom and also in Facebook. As a student of industrial upgrading and political economy of economic development myself, I really benefited from this. I think we have to accept the fact, and Professor Lankes mentioned about Gill and Kharas, the work that, from 1960 to 2008, there have been only 12 countries that could upgrade from low income to high income countries. So there is a narrow corridor. So upgrading and economic development is not necessarily not necessarily something that is given. It's a possibility, but it's a rare possibility. There is a narrow corridor that exists, and to sort of navigate into that narrow corridor, I'm really glad that the Bangladeshi youth from Youth Policy Forum have taken this work on themselves, as in they have come up with the idea of Coalition for Upgrading Bangladesh Economy with a dedicated focus that our export basket is now very much concentrated on garments. We need to go to more higher value products in garments and also beyond garments in electronics and automotives. So the lessons and the ideas that came today, the journey of South Korea and the other policy instruments that both Professor Lankes and Professor Bach mentioned would be really useful for our young people and also our researchers, academics, and policymakers to take a note of as we plan to navigate that narrow corridor of economic upgrading. As Professor Bach said, the youth need to have a can-do attitude. I think Youth Policy Forum members have that. But more importantly, one thing that resonated with me very strongly is failure is not an option. It is not an option for South Korea. It's not an option for Bangladesh because, as you know, we don't have too much natural resources. Our human capital is our capital, and we have come a long way from 1971 till now. But there is a longer way even now to go. And on that journey, we are incredibly delighted that we have Professor, Madam Pauline Boerma as our advisor guiding our young team. And we got Professor Lankes and Professor Bach today joining us. I'm incredibly grateful to all of them. And on behalf of Youth Policy Forum, I extend my sincere gratitude. And I hope this is just the beginning of their engagement and involvement with us. And we'll get to learn a lot more from them in the coming days. I personally look forward to more interactions with them. And I hope that we can continue this engagement. I would also like to thank Dr. Yoon in particular, who has been really kind in giving us, like, in managing us the connection of Professor Bak. So, if you see beyond the Western world, there are only few countries in East Asia that have succeeded and catched up so rapidly as South Korea. In Northeast Asia, Japan, Taiwan, South Korea are the only like countries, Singapore. And then in Southeast Asia, slightly modest success, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia. And if we go to Latin America, there are also countries like Costa Rica and all. But what I'm trying to say is there are not many success cases, and South Korea definitely is one. And Bangladesh has so much to learn from South Korea. So delighted that we had, like, Professor Bak here. And Professor Lankes, when you were presenting, my team was saying we have to rewatch his presentation because there is so much content and so much material in that. So I think, like, both of you gave us so many food for thought and to work as we take this coalition forward for a Bangladesh better served. Thank you, Zahir. Thank you, Pauline, Madam, our panelists, and Dr. Yoon. Thank you so much.